Welcome to Global Insights, and I'm very glad today to host Dr. Daniel Staetsky from Institute for Jewish Policy Research in London. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And I'm meeting you after two election campaigns in Great Britain and in the United States, the elections where Trump was elected as a president. And in both campaigns, I would say Jewish vote was very important. And it was not easy to understand how Jews would vote. Could you explain us about the Jews and the elections and if there is such thing as a Jewish vote?
Thank you. So I would say this. It's a tricky topic to explore. Why is that? You see, I'm a demographer, and if somebody asks me about, is there such a thing, is there something special about Jewish demography? I would say very easily, yes. No matter where you look, which process you look, you talk about Jewish mortality, you talk about Jewish fertility, there is something special about Jews. There's an overarching statement that you can say Jews live longer than others, their fertility differs typically from others, and you can be very confident about that. The same, by the way, is with Jewish economics, socioeconomic class. Jews in the diaspora today are mostly middle class. So you can make this catchy statement. That's what Jews are. When it comes to voting, it's really not like that. There isn't a catchy statement that can tell you in one sentence what Jewish vote is, and I hope to be able to prove it. So if still we have to, I'm in a position where I have to say something general about Jewish vote everywhere. Probably it would be, the most genuine sentence would be, is that there is no single pattern. So if, for example, you look at the United States of America, mostly you can see that Jews today support the Democratic Party. That hasn't changed for a while.
And that was, historically wise, that was the case for many years.
That's right. It's a very well established, very well documented pattern, beyond reasonable doubt. It doesn't stay the same at the same level, the level of support, but the general preference for Democratic Party remains. If then you ask, okay, can we see something like that also in Britain, or in Canada, or in Central Europe? Well, the answer is no, simply. So it's not like there's a single pattern. The pattern is slightly different in different places. And not only that, all these patterns are dynamic. It changes with changes in life, so to speak. So if there is probably if you have to come up with a general principle, I would probably say this: Jews as a whole, on the whole, avoid radical tendencies. They typically choose more than one centrist party and stick with this.
So they not tend to vote left-wing parties mostly?
Yeah, no.
Only in the United States, yeah?
Let's just say this. In the United States, we are in a uniquely disadvantaged position in the sense that we have two main parties, and that's the choice. So we don't have a wide spectrum of parties where Jews could, express radical preferences if they had them. In the United Kingdom, the situation is different. I will talk about this specifically. But in general, when there is an option of radical politics on the left and on the right, Jews are not very happy with that. They typically tend to go to the center. That's the general principle, probably the only one I'm prepared to commit to. The second thing I would say, if you ask yourself, is there then something called Jewish interest, unique Jewish interest? So they vote, they participate in a national process, but do they vote on the basis of some sort of unique, specific Jewish principle? I would say then, emphatically no. Or it's very, very difficult to discern whether that exists or not. If you just look at the data from different places, it's not entirely clear that there is such a thing, Jewish interest, whatever that Jewish interest is, whether it's Israel, whether it's internal Jewish politics, you don't see it very clearly. And if there is a strong factor like that, you would see it sooner or later in the data. So there is no such a thing. Interestingly, the data from the ideal data. So the Anti-Defamation League, they conduct a survey, frequently a survey of non-Jewish population about what people think about Jews. And one of the statements, which one of the opinions about Jews that is held by non-Jewish population is that Jews look after each other, they stick together, which you can translate into there is such a thing, the Jewish interest and Jewish mind. That's not something that you see in surveys or in Jewish voting behavior, no matter what. You just don't see it. Now, I said that the Jews are not too happy. They don't particularly stick to they don't embrace radical politics. As a rule, they're centrists. I would also say that when radical parties appear on the political map, certain types of Jews go for them. And then many natural experiments in that. So this is something that, these are the general principles, and I will illustrate them. I will illustrate them with perhaps American data, Canadian data, and British data. All of this is the data are very fresh, they're not very well known, so we will see what actually is happening. So let's start with the American vote. I mean, this is the most recent, the most interesting. Let's see what happened in the past, let's see what happened just recently. So if you examine this data, and this very well documented, so this is I'll present a slide for this. So what do we see here? We start from the early 80s. In the early 80s, that's the earliest point I choose to present. What you can see here is that the Jewish democratic vote is this blue, solid blue line, and the Republican vote is the solid red line. So the 80s, remember, this is the time that is strongly colored by Ronald Reagan and his presence. And what you see then, that at that time specifically, the Republican Party was not unpopular among Jews. So about 40% of Jewish voters at the time voted for the Republicans. 40.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. 40 is not 50 and it's not 60. It's still a minority, but it's a very sizable one. It's non-negligible minority. So that's the reality. And so Ronald Reagan, his type of politics, his type of figure, effectively created this kind of figures. Then, starting in the early 90s, this is when the Jewish preference for Democrats was emboldened, or the other way of saying, the Jewish preference for Republicans had gone down. So the early 90s is when probably we saw the lowest levels of support among Jews for the Republican Party. What happened between then and now, that it sort of slowly recovers. That recovery, as you can see, it's a sort of slow and long-term recovery. It's not something that you can link to a particular president. It's just recovery from very low levels observed in the 90s. The levels of support for Trump, by the way, on 3 occasions, are, first of all, very much in line with what happened in the past. Not much is happening. It's between 20 and 30% of Jewish electorate support Trump. First time, second time, and third time when Trump was
so
it's relevant.
You do not see a major change or major shift in the...
Not at all, in neither direction. Things are as they have always been, or almost, let's say. That's the American Jewish vote. As you can see, the American electorate, the non-Jewish electorate, is pretty much divided half and half. Jews are very different from the American electorate, but and that's probably the most clearly documented pattern of voting. It's a very big Jewish community. A lot of surveys conducted there. We know a lot about that politics.
I have a question with regard to that. So when we say the Jewish vote or the Jewish population is usually more educated, and it's middle class. Mostly, as you mentioned. So is that meaning, if we compare to the same reference groups, like people who are educated and the middle class, would we see a difference between the Jewish vote and the typical vote of this same reference group?
It depends on where you look. If you go to America, then the answer is no. Jews being middle class, some will say upper middle class. It's a famous statement that they vote like Puerto Ricans. So the answer is no. Their pattern is a sort of a minority pattern, ethnic minority pattern, and class doesn't interfere with this. In Britain, the situation may be more complex, but that example is enough. They don't vote exactly in accordance to their social positioning. We'll actually, I will show data about different ethnic groups in Britain as well, and you will see who Jews look like and who they're not like. So that's the United States. Now this is Britain. Now in Britain what we don't have is this very long-term perspective. British community, Jewish community is much smaller, it's more difficult to collect the data. So actually we don't have all that much. What we see here, however, is an interesting period in time when there was a significant shift in British politics, and we could see how the general electorate reacted to it and how Jews reacted to it, and that's very, very telling. So this particular graph starts with the election in 2019. It's a very important one. Why is that? Because at that time, there were obviously, as always, two major contestants in this election, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. The Labour Party at the time was led by, for all purposes, an exceptional figure, Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn was exceptional in a sense that he was not exceptional to the leadership of the Labour Party, but this was the first time, I would say, in the history of the Labour Party that it was clearly led by a representative of the far left within from the wide spectrum that Labour Party incorporates. Now, within the British context, both parties, by the way, they're not homogeneous. Each one has a spectrum of opinion. So the Labour Party, for example, incorporates people whose beliefs and attitudes are as close to communists as it gets. On the other hand, it includes classic social democrats. So, for example, Tony Blair could be characterized as the more right-wing figure within the Labour Party. So sometimes when they talk about themselves, the Labour Party electorate, the membership, they talk about it as a large tent. People of all sorts of persuasions can sit in that tent. The same happens in the Conservative Party. So they're more radically right-wing or left within those on that spectrum. So what happened with the Labour Party at the time is it was led by that particular figure representing, you could say, a far left position within Labour. What it meant, in the way it translates into Jewish concerns, is that particular figure was perceived by Jewish community as anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, and anti-Semitic. This was the time of anti-Semitism scandal in the Labour Party. So if we look actually what happened to the Jewish vote then, we can see, I think this is probably the clearest indication that there was something in the Jewish vote that told you that there is some sort of Jewish interest. So you can see that in 2019, for example, about 10% of Jewish electorate were prepared to vote for Labour and about 60% for the Conservatives. Now, I must say also that on a national scene, Labour Party was not very popular. I could say with great degree of confidence that the leadership of the Labour Party at the time, Jeremy Corbyn in particular, they were not popular with British electorate, full stop. And so they lost. They were particularly unpopular with Jews at the time. That is also something that you can see on the graph. Now, then, in 2020, there was another change in the British political landscape, in the Labour Party, where the party leadership changed. The year 2020 is the beginning of the period where Keir Starmer came. Keir Starmer is perceived, and I think fairly correctly, as a middle-of-the-road figure, certainly not representing the far left. There were attempts to purge the party politics from anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist elements. And as you can see, in terms of Jewish vote, it repaid. The popularity of Labor had gone up. It had gone up among Jews to the level where, well, in 22, for example, the situation was such that about 50% of Jews preferred actually the Labor Party, and minority of Jews, about 35, the Conservative Party. So there's a switch. There's a switch on preferences, and it's quite rapid. This, I would say, there's a clear reaction to the change at the top. Jeremy Corbyn is out, Keir Starmer is in, and we can see Jewish electorate responding to that. We can also see that the national electorate is responding to that. This is very unambiguous. So this is very different, for example, from what we could see in the United States. In the United States, first of all, the preferences don't change that radically. Okay? Jews stay mostly with the Democrats, less so with the Republicans. The figure which is as central to world politics as Trump come, and there isn't much of a reaction to him. British Jews react, and very, very interestingly. Now, the last thing that I can say, the last exhibit that I want to show is the Canadian Jewish politics. Now, this is not very different from British, I would say. What we could see, the period covered here is between 2018 and now, more or less. What you can see that in this particular case, Jewish electorate is becoming more right-wing on a very moderate scale. So in 2018, for example, the majority of 44% of Jews were with the Liberal Party. Liberal Party and Labour Party in Britain are rough equivalents. And about 40% were with the Conservatives. As time progressed, we now have almost 60% of Jews with the Conservatives and almost 25% with Liberals. So something is happening there. Some sort of drift in response to the events, I would imagine, in Canadian politics. But again, this is not quite like the British politics and not quite like American politics. You really need to look inside Canada, what happens inside Canada, with different groups, with different political parties to understand what's happening. But one thing is sure, it's quite dynamic. You cannot say Jews are like that.
So we have a few examples which are quite different. Like
Yes.
we have an American Jewish population which is, we may say, quite resilient to any change, external change, and it's just keeping the pattern after one election after another election with small changes, small shifts. While you say in the United Kingdom or in Canada, we have much more dynamic pattern, where it depends on the elections, depends who is in the charge, who is in the head of the party. So it's different patterns.
Yeah, very, very different patterns, and you really, if you want to understand them, you have to really look inside that particular place. It matters who is in charge. It matters who is in charge of a party. I hope in a short while, in a few months from now, I will have another data set, a very interesting one, from the Netherlands. Netherlands is interesting because Netherlands is outside of the Anglosphere. It's not America, it's not Canada, it's not United Kingdom, and it's something that is in continental Europe. The pattern there also is special. I cannot give any detail about that now. That data need to be published first. But what you would see, that you would see something else. You would see something else entirely, and again, local factors will have to be invoked in order to explain that. Now, what I would like to say also here is this. What I would suggest is this now, Alex. Let's look in detail what happened in Britain, actually. Jewish vote in Great Britain. In Great Britain, the election happened in July 2024. So we have voting intentions for Jews, for general population, but also for different ethnic groups inside Britain. It's probably the first time we have that degree of detail. It's different. It's very difficult to survey ethnic groups. They're small. First of all, you really have to have specialized data collection exercises. So the Institute for Jewish Policy Research has done that for Jews, and the British firm called YouGov has done it for ethnic minorities, and we could put the two data sets together. But let's look at Jews versus the general population first. So that's the last point in time. That's year 2024, the last national election. Labour is led by Keir Starmer. And what you can see with Jewish vote is that Labour had the support of about 46% of Jews. The conservatives, they had support about 30% of Jews. So it's not as it's not very dramatic. Now, you can see some interesting detail here in this picture, is that first of all, United Kingdom has more parties than just Conservative and Labour. It has parties that have some more radical predispositions, less, I'd say, centrist. The first to mention is Reform UK. So Reform UK is the right-wing force that the party as such is a new party, but it's not new electorate, and I would say the membership is also not new. So at all times, or for a long time, UK had that representative of right-wing politics. So it's a party that's clearly to the right of the Conservatives. Before Brexit, there was a United Kingdom Independence Party. So that party, the major guiding star of that party was to bring United Kingdom to leave the European Union. And you could say that if one has to come up with a single example of a successful party, or a single example of successful campaign, successful policy, it's probably that. We need to credit that party and the leader, Nigel Farage,
for initiating the process.
For initiating and actually carrying out that particular process. Okay, obviously the sentiment, the desire to leave Britain was not just UKIP; it was much broader, as the referendum confirmed. But that was a single issue of that party. That party became irrelevant the moment Brexit happened. Then there was another party. There was another party called Brexit UK that actually the purpose of that party was to see Brexit implemented. It's not enough to vote. You need also to implement that, to negotiate it, to create a new system that links Britain to Europe and elsewhere. So there was that particular political force that organized pretty much immediately. Then it also became irrelevant, let's say. What is relevant now? The new agenda of what's called Reform UK that inherited those political forces is, I would say, very critical view of immigration, of the amount of the number of immigrants that come. They side with greater checks on immigration. Another characteristic of that is probably anti-woke politics, very critical of wokeism.
It's a classical right-wing agenda these days.
Exactly. That's one representation. Now, what you can see is that that party received about 6% of Jewish vote. 6. So whether it's a lot or a little, it's anyone's guess. Okay, it's in the eye of the beholder, as they say. But that's the situation. So there are some Jews that gave, who see that party as an
I would say
embodiment
it's
of their
substantial
politics.
number. 6%.
It's not negligible. It's
not
zero,
negligible.
certainly. Yeah. And then on the left-hand side of the political map, we have the Green Party. The Green Party is also, just like in Europe, you could say it's a combination of ecological concerns and political attitudes on other matters, which align it with perhaps far left, you could say. It's certainly left of Labour. And that party has about 10% of Jewish vote. So 6 Reform UK, the right, and 10 left. So there is a presence of Jews on the margins. But from Jewish point of view, these are not the mainstream, where the mainstream Jewish vote goes. The interesting comparison here is that Jewish vote in that particular year, in 2024, was not that different from UK as a whole. As you can see, at the level of the UK as a whole, there's a strong preference for Labour. There's much less preference for the Conservatives. What is also quite clear that about many more non-Jews preferred Reform UK. It's about 15%. So, but by and large, these are very similar figures. That's how it looks in 2024. Now, what I would also say is this. One dimension that I would like to highlight here is that, you know, when you read books of history, and Jewish history, Let's say Jewish history in 20th century, 19th century, modern history. One aspect of Jewish history that's really systematically underplayed is the political divisions inside Jewish community. A lot of emphasis is put on the relationship between Jews and non-Jews, how different political parties saw Jews. There is not much of an emphasis on the political life inside Jewish communities. And anyone who has a Facebook and participates in these discussions knows that the internal divisions between Jews are very real, they're very bitter, they parallel divisions that exist in the society, perhaps they're more bitter. The role of Israel, and is there such a thing that, the concept of Jewish interest is discussed?
I think the political situation in Israel illustrates that, in the best way. You can see the level of the hostility and the division between the people.
It's interesting to see this, that...
Good example, Israel.
Israel is an example of you would say it shouldn't surprise anyone. It shouldn't surprise anyone because politics is something that exists inside every society and in every country. Nobody is surprised by the fact that British society is divided. Nobody ever said that is surprising. Nobody ever said that how can British, being a nation, a single nation, a homogeneous nation, whatever, how is it that they can have politics that's so divisive? Well, every nation, every group can have divisive politics. Israel has it, but from my point of view, what is even more interesting, Jews in the diaspora, being a minority in the diaspora, they have exactly that. The discussions about what constitutes, if there is Jewish interest, how Jews should vote, what is the primary concern, what is the secondary concern, are conservatives or labor good for Jews or good for Israel? Is it even an interesting question to consider? Is it a legitimate point on which the vote depends? That is a matter of very vigorous and sometimes bitter, let's say, conversation inside Jews. So, and so there are camps, there are groups inside the Jewish community with very different voting patterns and preferences. What defines those camps is level of, I'd say, religiosity. A religious lifestyle. I'll show you what I mean. So, we looked at the American Jewish vote before, and what we could see that it had a very strong preference for Democrats over years. Didn't change all that much. Certainly didn't change with Trump. This is a snippet, another look at that data. So, if you look at the blue solid line, it replicates this data. That's how Jewish vote look between the 80s and now. The last year, 2024, is not here yet. I didn't have time to update this, but we already know nothing happened, nothing significant happened there. So the blue line shows you those 30%, let's say, that support the Republicans. The gray line and the orange line show something else, show the levels of support for Republicans among the more religious Jews. So if you look at the orange line, you can see this is the Haredi vote. And what happens at the Haredi, with the Haredi vote, and that's also not new, by the way.
Haredi, you mean Orthodox Jews?
Strictly Orthodox Jews. Strictly Orthodox Jews inside America, their levels of support for the Republicans is around 90% most of the time. Not at all. There are some there are years where actually it's about 50-50. So it's not that interesting what exactly happened there, but what you could see that 90% of strictly Orthodox Jews voted for Ronald Reagan, and 90% of them voted for Trump.
So they have a strict pattern of
yes,
voting.
And it's not new. Now, if you go to what's called modern Orthodox are Jews who are not strictly Orthodox, but they are also not secular, let's call them that. So, traditional Jews, religious Jews, okay? They're somewhere in between. So if we go as early as the 80s, about 60% of them were for the Republic, voted for the Republicans. It's a majority. It's not an overwhelming majority. 60 is not 90. But still, they were very different from Jewish electorate as a whole. They, by and large, supported Ronald Reagan. Since then, the levels of support for the Republican Party had gone down to about 40%, something like this. So that's the Jewish polarity. If you look inside the Jewish community, there are two or three, any way you want to see it, at least three, I would say, worlds. The pro-Republican world, the pro-democratic camp, and people in between. And that is by and large stable, as far as the years of the Cold War. Now, what we don't have those magnificent series going to from now to the 80s for the British Jews, for anyone really. For them, there's a unique advantage that we have in the United States, but we do have something for 2024 in Britain. And what we can see is exactly the same. So here, in this slide, the British Jewish electorate now is split into 4 groups, defined by religiosity. The first is strictly Orthodox, our good friends. Well, we can see that the majority of them support the Conservative Party, 65% or so. And that's today, right? On a day that Conservative Party lost among Jews as a whole, and in Britain, majority of them supported the Conservative Party, minority supported Labour. When you go to the mainstream Orthodox, which is probably the, let's say, roughly modern Orthodox, roughly in American jargon, the levels of support for the Conservatives are slightly less, but still, it's unambiguous. This is the conservative ground, let's say. As you go to groups with lesser religiosity, the progressive Jews, which is Reform and Liberal, this is the Labour land, let's say. This is where we call it Labour landslide. 60% of them support Labour, less than 20% of them support the Conservatives. And as you go to what's called Jews without affiliation, in this particular case, the survey asked the British Jews, how do you call yourself? How you self-identify? Are you strictly Orthodox, mainstream, progressive, by the nature of the synagogue to which they belong? Or some of them didn't belong anywhere. They're very secular. They don't have an affiliation. So effectively, we're looking here at degrees of religiosity. So those without affiliation, the most secular, are pretty much likely progressive. So that is, again, there are 2 or 3 sub-communities within the Jewish community, and the political discussion among them is, I'd say, very vigorous and sometimes quite bitter. The last thing that I would like to show is this, and this is completely, I don't think it has been done before. YouGov, as I said earlier, YouGov is a major British pollster. And in 2024, they went far. They put significant effort into creating an ethnic sample. So they monitor voting preferences all the time. You can go to their website at any time and to see what voting preferences are today. That's in itself is not innovative. But what is innovative that they decided at the time that they will explore it within ethnic groups, and the ethnic groups that they particularly explored were 3. First was the British Indian. The second was the British Pakistani and Bangladeshi electorate. You could say that Pakistani and Bangladeshi corresponds to Muslim as well. And then there's British Black. Because we have data from YouGov and data from Institute for Jewish Policy Research, we could simply compare it 1-to-1. And that's what the comparison is. So first of all, British Jews behave electorally in at this particular point in time, exactly like British Indians. I could almost smuggle you data for the British Indians and say, okay, this is Jews. And you would not feel the fraud. You would not identify fraud. So the majority of 40 to 45% is for Labour, about 30% for the Conservatives, so they're slightly pro-Labour. Interestingly, the support for Reform UK, which is the right-wing political force, is 6% with Jews and 5% with British Indian. So that is also very similar. Support for the left-wing political force, which is Green Party, is 10% among Jews, 12% among Indians. So these communities are very, very similar. British Indians are also a middle-class community. By the way, if you compare their socioeconomic standing, their educational levels, that's all not new, by the way. Particularly, it's in the last census, which is 4 years ago. But you can also go back and you can see that these are very similar communities in terms of with their position in society. Now let's go to the British, to the British, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi, which is a Muslim, let's say, an approximation of Muslim part of the electorate. What you see there is something completely different. There, the preference for the conservatives is rather low. There's a strong preference for Labour, but it's not exclusive, actually. What they prefer, at a level similar to Labour, is the Green Party. So 44% of them are Labour, inclined to vote for Labour. Almost 30% vote for the Green. There's a very small percentage, 3%, that would give their vote to Reform UK. Right, so that is the way it looks. So it's clearly left-leaning, not even Labour-leaning necessarily, but even further to the left as a whole. And finally, when you come to the British Black, that's also another something very special about them. This is really the Labour ground. 70% of them support Labour. They go with Labour like American Jews go with the Democrats, to that level. That's
for me a little bit strange. I know yesterday we discussed with Professor Toms the patterns of voting, and it seems for me strange that people who come for reason for the United Kingdom, because in their homeland it's not good to live in. That's not accidentally they decided to live and to come to a new country. So why they preserve the vote which made their country miserable? That's strange. Because according to this logic, you and I, we were born in Soviet Union, so we should for all our life vote for the Communist Party. And I don't know, most of the immigrants from the former USSR, as I know them, they don't vote for the communists. They vote for different parties, mostly the opposite. They vote to some right-wing parties because they experienced something in their life and they don't want, that the United Kingdom will become the former Soviet Union, for example.
Yeah.
But I understand that that's the probably situation a little bit different.
It is, and also what is quite clear, there have been several attempts to explain the American Jewish vote, by the way. There are all sorts of competing hypotheses. I don't think there's an accepted way to explain it, the mainstream way, but there are some explanations, and some of them, in my view, are more successful than others. And the more successful ones talk about not necessarily where Jews are coming from, let's say. That's not what determines their vote. What determines their vote is a very specific situation in which they find themselves in that particular country. And other groups, when they choose who to vote for, they look at what other groups are doing in simplicity and what's common to them with those groups. In the American case, they look around and they see, for example, that the Republican Party has a very strong base of support among evangelical Christians. And then Jews ask themselves, what's common to us and these people, not with respect to Israel, no, in America. What kind of America they want to see, and do we want to see that kind of America? Do we align here, locally?
Yeah, I understand, but in the United States, historically wise, I can understand why they tend to support Democratic Party.
Why is
because
that?
Historically, it's clear that Jews were suppressed in the United States, and the Republicans over and over were just not allowing them to integrate into the society. And we're speaking about beginning of the 20th century. I'm not speaking about the present times, but historically, I can understand the Jews who came and wanted equal rights. And let's remember that many social clubs in the United States did not accept Jews till the early 70s. And all these social clubs, this or another way, they are not associated with the Democratic Party, they are more associated with the Republicans.
Yeah.
Now I understand the situation is clearly different. But historically wise, I can somehow understand that, tend to support Democratic Party. Today, of course, situation is different, but maybe this is a different topic to discuss with you.
Yeah,
One time we
Yeah.
talk about it. Yeah.
Let's just say this. If indeed Jewish vote in America was determined by events in the past in some hard way, and that was the rule of human nature, I would accept it. But the problem is that that rule doesn't work in other places. In other places you can see, first of all, very different Jewish patterns, and secondly, changing Jewish patterns. Significant changes in them within a short framework. That's what we see. The moment you see change, perhaps there are stable factors that exist out there. But the moment you see change, you have to explain that. You can't stick with an explanation that something in the past determines that vote. I would also say that both Jews and non-Jews, and there's no difference really, have the amazing capacity when it comes to politics to create alternative explanation and forget the past, the recent past, the historical past very quickly when they need to, in response to certain circumstances, right? We see it in politics all the time. You can present as, you know, the conservatives as the most anti-Semitic party, or the Labour as the most anti-Semitic party. So ultimately, rhetorically, everything becomes possible. So the explanations for preferences must lie elsewhere. So, and that, for me, makes the whole Jewish voting patterns as an interesting topic. It's not as well explained as, for example, Jewish demography, or even Jewish economics. We just started with this. We haven't had much data until recently. We're now getting more. And I would say, to finalize, I hope in the next conversation I will have new data set for the Netherlands. You will see something new and interesting there. And all I can say, yeah, follow my data.
Dr. Daniel Staetsky, thank you very much for this valuable input. And you're, of course, from the Institute for the Jewish Policy Research in London. And guys, stay for more on Global Insights channel. Thank you again.